Northwind Station. Part 1. The Train That Never Came. Somewhere in the far reaches of Alaska, buried under ice and forgotten snowfields, sits a desolate railway station called Northwind Station. Only one freight train stops here each month, carrying fuel, medical supplies, and occasionally a lost soul looking for the end of the world. On a brittle January morning, the station's keeper, Nick Logan, 62, a retired Army engineer with a deep scar over his right brow, woke up feeling uneasy. He'd served in 2 wars and survived a plane crash, but that morning, the silence felt like a warning. Train number 47 from Anchorage was due at 8:15 a.m. By 9 o'clock, nothing. No signal, no smoke on the horizon, not even static from the old radio tower. Nick put on his parka and stepped into the icy wind. The tracks leading into the tundra were untouched, not even a bird print, just frost. Then, around 11:32, the radio crackled. A voice, shaking, distorted. Northwind Station, this is we're off track. Everything's white, like the sky came down. We can't tell where we are anymore. And then, silence. Nick froze. The last time a transmission like that came through these mountains was during a blizzard in '87, a helicopter crash that killed everyone aboard. But this was different. By evening, Anchorage Rail Command officially listed train number 47 as missing in transit. People in town whispered about cursed tracks, ghost rails. Nick didn't believe in any of that until the next morning. She came walking out of the forest. No coat, no hat. A girl in her 20s, barefoot, eyes blank like fog. She sat down on the cold bench of the empty station and simply said, "The train didn't disappear. It just didn't make it back." Nick slowly approached her, heart pounding. "Were you on that train?" "I don't know," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I think something stayed behind, and it's still calling." Then they heard it. A train whistle, distant, mournful, echoing from somewhere deep within the frozen woods. But no train ever came. The girl with no past. Logan didn't scare easy. After 30 years of military service, 2 divorces, and watching his childhood home burn down in Texas, the man had seen just about everything. But not this. He sat across from the girl, inside the station's narrow break room, a metal mug of coffee steaming between them. She hadn't said another word since that single, cryptic line on the platform. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold, but she didn't shiver. She didn't blink much, either, just stared out the window toward the tracks that led nowhere. Nick finally broke the silence. "You got a name?" The girl blinked slowly, as if the question came from another dimension. "I think it's Claire. Or maybe Clara." She looked down at her hands. "I don't remember much after the train passed the glacier bend." Then there was fog. Thick, like it was alive. Nick leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. He didn't like this. He didn't like the dead radio, the train that never showed, and he sure as hell didn't like strangers walking out of nowhere in minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit with no coat and no memory. "You sure you're not from one of the ranger stations?" he asked. "There's a wildlife outpost about 40 clicks east." She shook her head. "There was a man on the train," she said suddenly. "He wore a conductor's jacket, but his face wasn't right. His eyes were wrong. Too still. He walked down the aisle, over and over, like he was looking for something. Or someone." Nick's skin crawled. When the fog came, she continued, voice now hollow, he stood in the doorway. Everyone froze. No one spoke. Then the train, it started to sink. Sink. She nodded, slowly, into the snow. But the snow wasn't snow anymore. It was like light, blinding white light. And it hummed. She looked up at Nick, eyes suddenly sharp, lucid. "And then I was here." Nick didn't know what to believe. But there was something in her tone, in the emptiness behind her voice, that shook him deeper than he wanted to admit. He picked up the radio mic and tried again. "Northwind Station to Anchorage Command. Do you copy?" Static. Then, just for a second, something else. A voice. But it didn't sound like Anchorage. It was a whisper. A man's whisper. Gravelly, cold, barely audible under the hum. The train never stopped. Nick jerked back. Claire stood. "You heard it too." She walked to the window and pointed toward the tree line, where the snow-covered woods began. "There's something in there," she said, still watching. Nick followed her gaze, and for just a second, he saw it, a dark figure, motionless, watching them from the edge of the forest. Then it was gone, the shadow in the pines. The next morning came slow and heavy. The sky over Northwind Station was pale gray, like a lid pressing down on the earth. Snow had fallen again overnight, erasing all tracks. Even Claire's footprints from the day before were gone. Nick didn't sleep. He sat in the station's control room, sipping black coffee, watching the forest through the frosted window. The figure from the night before haunted him. It wasn't an animal. It stood too still, too tall. Claire was in the back room, asleep on a cot with an extra wool blanket. She hadn't said much after what she saw, but before she drifted off, she told Nick one more thing. I think the train is still moving, but not in this world. That sentence echoed in Nick's mind. Around noon, something strange happened. The temperature dropped. Fast. The thermometer outside went from -20 to -40 in minutes. The wind died completely. The air grew too quiet, like the entire land had gone mute. Then, deep in the forest came a sound. A slow, grinding metal sound. Nick stepped outside, shotgun in hand. The cold hit him like a hammer. He followed the sound, crunching through snow toward the trees. Claire appeared behind him, quietly, already dressed in boots and gloves Nick had found in the storage locker. She didn't ask where he was going. She just followed. The two moved into the woods, surrounded by tall pine trees covered in frost. The sound got louder. It was like train wheels turning, slowly, without a track. Then they saw it. An open space. A frozen clearing. And in the center, rails, old, rusted tracks covered by ice, stretched in a straight line into nowhere. They weren't on any map. Nick would have known, but here they were, perfectly laid, and standing near the tracks, the figure. Not moving, facing them. He wore an old train conductor's uniform, torn, covered in frost. His face was pale and expressionless, eyes wide open but lifeless. Claire grabbed Nick's arm. That's him, the one I saw on the train. Nick aimed his shotgun. Sir, you all right? The man didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then he turned and walked onto the tracks. As he stepped forward, the forest began to change. The air shimmered. The snow at their feet started to glow, not brightly, but like something beneath was trying to shine through. And then, far behind them, a whistle. Clear, loud, real. Nick turned toward the sound. Claire didn't move. She was staring at the tracks. Her lips moved without sound. Then she spoke. It's coming back. Nick looked at her. What is? She turned to him. The train. The tracks beneath the snow. Nick and Claire stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the old, frozen railway that seemed to lead nowhere. The conductor had vanished again, like he was never really there. Only the sound of the distant whistle remained, fading slowly into silence. The forest was still. Nick examined the rails. They were real, solid metal, rusted but intact. He knelt and ran a gloved hand along one of the rails. It was cold, but faintly vibrating, as if something far away was moving along them. Claire stood close behind. She wasn't trembling from the cold. She was completely calm, like she had accepted something that Nick couldn't yet understand. They followed the tracks. The line cut deep through the pine woods, like it had always been there, but buried under snow and time. The deeper they walked, the darker the forest became. The pines grew taller. The light grew dimmer. There was no sound of birds, no rustling branches, just the crunch of boots on snow. After nearly an hour of walking, they came upon something unexpected. A train car. Just one, standing silently on the track. Half covered in ice, windows cracked, metal twisted by age and cold. Nick approached it slowly. The door was slightly open. He glanced at Claire. She nodded. Inside, it was dark. Dust floated in the air like snowflakes. The seats were torn. The walls were scratched. And on the far side of the car, drawn with what looked like charcoal, was a name. Claire. Nick turned toward her. She didn't react. She stepped forward and placed her hand on the letters. He looked closer. There were more names, some scratched deep into the metal walls, others written with black ink that had long since frozen into the surface. All of them were names of passengers. All of them were marked with dates. All the dates were from the last 5 years. But Train 47 only went through once a month, and it had never reported missing passengers. No one had ever filed complaints. Nick stepped back. This train had been collecting people, and no one noticed. Claire finally spoke. She said she remembered sitting in this car. Not long ago. She remembered the fog, the conductor, the silence. But more than anything, she remembered what he said to her. He told her she was chosen, not for something good, not for something heroic, but because she had no one waiting for her. Nick stared at her. Then she added something else. She said the train only took people who wouldn't be missed, and now it was coming back for her. Nick looked through the broken window. Far down the line, in the distant woods, a faint red light was blinking. A light from a train's front lamp. It was moving toward them. He grabbed her hand. They had to leave. Now. No way back. Nick pulled Claire's hand as they turned from the train car. The red light in the forest was no longer distant. It was approaching steadily, blinking through the trees like a heartbeat. The forest felt tighter now, as if the trees were leaning in, watching them. They ran. Snow crunched underfoot. Branches slapped against their coats. The silence that had filled the woods all morning had been replaced by a low, humming vibration, like rails coming to life underground. Claire glanced back once. The light was closer. Nick didn't speak. He focused on the path ahead, retracing their steps toward the station. But nothing looked familiar anymore. The trees seemed wrong. The shapes of the snowbanks were different. The tracks they had followed were missing, buried again beneath white frost. They stopped at a fork in the trail. Claire looked around, confused. This wasn't here before. Nick agreed. Something had shifted. He pulled out his compass. It spun wildly in his hand. The air grew colder, but it wasn't natural cold. It pressed against their bodies, crawling up their skin like invisible fingers. From behind them, the sound of metal wheels began to roll. Nick turned. Down the hidden track, a train was moving. Not fast, but steady. A black engine. No smoke. No sound from inside. The windows were dark. Nick raised a shotgun. Claire put a hand on the barrel and gently lowered it. It's not going to stop. They stepped off the trail and moved behind a tree as the train passed. It moved like it was gliding. Car after car rolled by, all of them old, rusted, silent. Then the last car came. It stopped. A door opened. Inside, they saw no people, just shadows. Then a voice came from the doorway. Calm. Mail. Clear. Claire, your seat is still waiting. Nick gripped the shotgun tightly. She's not going anywhere. The voice replied without anger. She already did. The air shook slightly, and the trees bent forward. Not from wind, but from something heavier. Claire stepped back. I remember now. I never got off. I wasn't supposed to. Nick looked at her. You walked out of the woods. You survived. She looked at him with eyes that suddenly seemed distant. I think I died on that train. And something just let me walk out. The wind picked up. The door to the train remained open. Nick stood between her and it. I don't care who's calling you. You're not going back. Then the voice changed. It sounded like his son, the one Nick had lost in Afghanistan years ago. Dad, let her go. Nick froze. Claire pulled him back. Don't listen. The train began to slide forward again. The door slowly closed. Then it was gone. No tracks. No light. No sound. Just snow and wind. Nick and Claire stood alone in the clearing. No explanation. Just silence. The station that wasn't the same. Nick and Claire made their way back through the forest, moving cautiously, side by side. The snow felt heavier now, and the path they had taken earlier seemed to resist them with every step. The forest, once a silent companion, now felt like it was watching, listening, waiting. By the time they reached the edge of the tree line, the last light of day was gone. The sky hung low with clouds, and the wind had picked up again. Northwind Station stood ahead, exactly where they had left it. But something was off. The radio tower's light, which always blinked red in the night, was dark. The windows of the building reflected no glow from inside. It looked abandoned. Nick gripped his shotgun and stepped forward, motioning for Claire to stay behind him. They approached slowly. The front door was slightly open, creaking in the wind. Inside, the room was cold. The fireplace, which Nick had kept burning for 3 days straight, was out. The wood pile was untouched. The mugs they had used were gone from the table. Even the cot where Claire had slept was missing. Nick called out, but the only reply was the whistle of the wind pushing through the cracks in the walls. Claire stepped inside beside him and looked around, confused. None of her footprints from the morning were on the floor. Her coat and gloves, which Nick had given her, were nowhere to be found. It was like they had never been there. Nick checked the radio. It was gone. Only a clean shelf remained, as if no equipment had ever been mounted there. He turned toward Claire. She looked pale again, staring at the walls. Then she spoke. She said she remembered something else. A sound from inside the train. A bell that rang once before everything went quiet. She said it didn't sound like a train bell. It sounded like a church bell, like the start of a funeral. Nick didn't know what to say. He reached into the drawer under the desk for the logbook he used to keep track of deliveries and train arrivals. It wasn't there. He checked the filing cabinet. Empty. Everything was gone. The records, the calendars, the printed train schedule on the wall. All of it had vanished. Claire looked at the corner of the room where a photograph had once hung. It was a framed picture of Nick and his former crew, taken in 1998 during a blizzard. The frame was there, but the photograph inside was blank. Just paper. Nothing on it. Nick whispered to himself. Was this still the same station? Claire suddenly said she felt like they had crossed into something. Not another world, but a version of their own that had been hollowed out. A shadow. Nick tried to argue, but deep down he felt it too. The air in the station felt thinner, colder, as if time itself had slipped. Claire walked toward the window. Outside, the woods were quiet again, but just beyond the tree line, two faint lights began to glow. They were low, steady, and moving slowly toward the station. They weren't headlights. They weren't flashlights. They were eyes, and they were getting closer. Eyes in the dark. The two glowing lights hovered just beyond the tree line. Nick and Claire stood frozen at the station window, their breath fogging the glass. At first, Nick tried to convince himself that it was a trick of the snow or moonlight, maybe a moose or a wolf, something wild with reflective eyes. But the way the lights moved, perfectly level, perfectly slow, didn't match anything alive that he knew. Claire backed away from the window and whispered that she had seen those eyes before. She said they were inside the train, watching her through the glass as it sank into the snow. She didn't think they belonged to any person. Nick tightened his grip on the shotgun and stepped toward the door. He wasn't the type to wait around when something unknown was creeping closer. He flung the door open and aimed straight toward the trees. The wind hit him full in the chest, sharp and dry. The lights didn't flinch. They paused for a moment, like they were surprised to be seen, and then began to move again. Not toward the station now, but sideways, skimming along the edge of the forest. Claire came up beside him. She said they should follow. Nick wasn't so sure, but the station didn't feel safe anymore. It felt hollow, like someone had removed its memory. They had no food, no heat, and no way to contact the outside world. Following the lights felt stupid, but staying felt worse. They gathered what little they could: a flashlight, Nick's knife, a flare gun with 2 shots, and a shotgun with only 4 shells left. Then they followed. The forest swallowed them quickly. The snow was deeper here, and the air carried no scent, no sound. The lights led them through winding paths, between trees that looked more like bones than branches. They didn't move in a straight line. It felt like the lights were testing them, watching if they would give up or turn back. After nearly 30 minutes of silence, they entered a wide clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood something unexpected. A house. A 2-story wooden cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. Lights on in the windows. A front porch covered in snow, but clearly lived in. It didn't make any sense. There were no cabins on the map anywhere near Northwind Station. No hunters' shelters. No ranger posts. Nothing. Claire whispered that she had seen this house before, in a dream she used to have as a child. A house with lights always on, but no one ever came to the door. Nick raised a shotgun and approached slowly. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Then the door creaked open by itself. The hallway inside was warm. Too warm. A fire crackled somewhere deeper in the house, and the scent of burning pine filled the air. Claire stepped in behind him and called out. A voice answered. It came from the second floor. It said, "Welcome home." Nick froze. It was his own voice. The house that remembers. Nick gripped the shotgun tight as he stepped inside the cabin. The warmth hit him instantly, not just from the fireplace. It was the warmth of memory, of comfort, the kind that doesn't belong in the middle of a frozen wilderness. The floors creaked under his boots. The walls were lined with wooden panels, each corner glowing with soft orange light from oil lamps. Claire followed close behind, silent but alert. From upstairs, the voice called again. It sounded exactly like Nick, but calmer, younger, like the version of himself he had forgotten years ago. The voice said they had been waiting. Nick called out, asking who was there. The voice didn't answer with words this time. Instead, the sound of a piano started playing from one of the rooms down the hall. A melody he hadn't heard in decades. His mother used to play it on stormy nights in Texas. The notes were soft, hesitant, almost unsure of themselves. Claire turned toward the sound. Nick told her to stay close, but she was already moving. They stepped into the room with the piano. There was no one playing it. The keys moved on their own. The song continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. On top of the piano sat a photograph. Claire reached for it. It showed a little girl standing in front of a train station. Not Northwind, but somewhere older, black and white. The girl looked just like her. Same eyes, same hair, even the same scarf she had worn when she came out of the woods. She said she'd never seen the photo before, but something about it made her stomach turn. She felt like the photo had been taken after she went missing, like someone had been keeping track. Nick checked the walls. There were more pictures now. One of them in uniform from 1984, standing in front of a tent in Afghanistan. One of Claire as a teenager, reading under a tree. One a young man neither of them recognized, burned at the edges, standing next to the missing train, number 47, fully intact. Nick stepped back, heart pounding. None of this should exist. Suddenly, heavy footsteps sounded upstairs. Not rushed, not aggressive, just steady, measured, like someone walking with a purpose. Nick moved toward the stairs. Claire grabbed his arm and said they shouldn't go up, that the house wasn't showing the memories by accident. It was choosing what they saw. Nick said he didn't care. He had to know who or what was upstairs. They climbed the stairs together. The second floor was darker. The walls were lined with mirrors. Not decorative ones, tall, narrow, full-length mirrors that ran from the floor to the ceiling. Dozens of them, each facing the hallway. But none of the mirrors showed reflections, just shadows. Nick stepped closer to one. Instead of his reflection, he saw his son, Alex, sitting on a bench at a train station, reading a letter. The exact letter Nick had written but never sent. Claire looked into another mirror. She saw herself, younger, riding the train alone, crying into her hands. They kept walking until they reached the last door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly open. Light leaked through the crack. Nick pushed it open. Inside was a small room. A desk, a chair, a single oil lamp. On the desk, a train schedule. But the dates were all wrong. They were for the future. All of them. Each line listed a new departure. New names. Some of the names they recognized. People who had gone missing over the years near the station. Others they didn't know. And at the bottom of the list, Claire, return scheduled. Nick, return pending. Nick stepped back. Claire whispered that maybe they never left the train. Maybe the house wasn't a place. Maybe it was the stop before the final destination. The house that wouldn't let go. Nick stared at the list of names, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Each line on the schedule was typed clearly, methodically, as if someone or something had been planning every passenger's fate. The return dates were in perfect order, not based on time, but on something else. Maybe choices, maybe fear. Claire leaned over his shoulder and pointed to one name near the top of the list. It was a boy from her hometown in Oregon. He had disappeared when she was in high school. No one ever found him. His name was on the manifest, with a note beside it, refused to board. Rerouted. Nick asked who was creating this schedule. Claire said she didn't think it was made by anyone human. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut. They both jumped. Nick rushed back and tried the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The lock clicked from the other side, like someone was holding it shut. He stepped back and raised a shotgun. Claire told him not to shoot. Not yet. The oil lamp on the desk flickered violently, casting long shadows across the walls. The air changed. The warm, almost dreamlike comfort that had filled the cabin now turned stale, suffocating. It smelled like dust and time. Then a sound from inside the walls, like whispers, faint and fast, like someone flipping through pages in another room. Claire covered her ears. The voices weren't just sounds. They were thoughts. Her own memories being played back to her in another voice. She heard her mother calling her name. She heard the voice of the conductor asking if she was ready to leave everything behind. Nick turned and saw one of the mirrors on the hallway wall start to pulse. A dull white light blinked behind the glass. He stepped toward it. The glass rippled like water. He touched it with the tip of his finger. Instantly, he saw something else. Not a reflection, but a moment. A memory. It was him, years ago, sitting in a train car, exhausted after his final mission overseas. But in the memory, something was wrong. He wasn't alone. Across from him sat a man in a black conductor's coat, and the man was smiling. Nick yanked his hand away. Claire pulled open the desk drawer. Inside was a small brass key and a folded note. The note read, "You boarded once. You may leave only if both want to forget." She looked at Nick. He said he would never forget his son. Not to escape this place. Not to escape anything. Claire said she didn't know if she could forget either. But she also didn't know if she could stay. The walls of the cabin groaned. Something was shifting in the structure. The floorboards bent beneath their feet as if breathing. From the hallway came the sound of a train bell. Once, then twice, then silence. Nick grabbed the key and the shotgun and tried the door again. This time it opened. But the hallway was no longer filled with mirrors. Now it was filled with doors, each one different. Some old and wooden, some metal, some covered in frost, others scorched like they had come from fire. One of them had Nick's name carved into the surface. Another had Claire's. Nick whispered that they were being asked to choose. Not a path, but a version of themselves. Claire stepped forward. She opened her door. Inside was a train platform at sunset. Quiet, warm, empty. She turned back. Nick didn't open his yet. Instead, he asked one last question. What happens if neither of them chooses? The train bell rang a third time, and the cabin began to collapse. The cost of leaving. The walls groaned louder as the cabin shook under their feet. The lamps exploded one by one, sending sparks across the dark hallway. Nick held tight to the shotgun in one hand and the brass key in the other. Claire was already halfway through her door, staring into the surreal train platform that stretched out like a dream. The sky inside it was orange and pink, like a memory caught in sunset. Nick looked at his own door. It hadn't moved. No glow, no wind, no sound. It just stood there waiting. She said she couldn't hear the train, that maybe this was a way out, a place where they could rest. Nick didn't answer. He walked slowly toward his own door and placed the key into the lock. The door opened with a sharp click. But behind it, there was no platform. There was a battlefield. The desert sun was beating down. Smoke and ash choked the sky. Nick saw younger versions of his team, soldiers from 20 years ago. He saw the convoy. He saw the ambush. He saw his son, Alex, running toward the fire. And then he saw himself, standing still, unable to move. Nick slammed the door shut. He turned back to Claire. He told her his door wasn't a way out. It was a trap. Claire said maybe the stranger at the crossing. The wind howled over the trees as Nick and Claire stood in the clearing, watching train 47 vanish into the distant mist. Their breath came out in thick clouds, but they were alive. The cold bit their skin, but it was real. No more whispering walls. No more mirrors showing shadows. No more impossible doors. Nick turned toward Claire. He asked if she was okay. She nodded, still catching her breath. Her hair was damp with frost, and her eyes were red, but focused. They had made it out, but neither of them said the words. They didn't celebrate. They didn't cry, because something felt wrong. The forest around them looked the same as before, tall pine trees, snow piled on the branches, ice crunching beneath their boots, but it was quieter. Too quiet. Nick suggested they head back toward the real station. He knew the land well. Even without a compass, his instincts kicked in. They walked for half an hour, then another. Still no sign of the station. Claire stopped. and asked him how long it should have taken. He admitted they should have reached it already. She said maybe the house hadn't let them go completely, that maybe they had just fallen deeper into another layer. Then they heard it, a voice, not far off the trail. It was singing, an old folk tune, slow and gentle, echoing through the trees. They followed it. Eventually, they saw smoke curling above the trees. They moved carefully until they reached another clearing. A man sat by a fire. He looked to be in his 50s, rugged, wearing a heavy coat with patches sewn into the shoulders. He was stirring something in a small metal pot and humming to himself. A wooden shack stood behind him, crooked but sturdy. He didn't seem surprised to see them. He looked up, gave a quiet smile, and said, "Been a long time since anyone came out of that train." Nick and Claire froze. Nick raised his shotgun slightly. "How do you know about the train?" The man gestured to the logs beside the fire. "Sit down. If you're cold, you're welcome here. No tricks, just stories." Claire sat first. Nick sat after her, still on edge. The man handed them a cup of something hot. It smelled like herbs and berries. Then he introduced himself. "Call me Reed. I used to be like you. Passenger. Train 12, not 47. Long time ago. I got off before it took me too deep." Nick asked what he meant by too deep. Reed looked at the fire. "The train don't run on fuel. It runs on regret, on memory. It feeds on the people who carry too much they can't let go of. But it never forces. That's the trick. It gives you doors. You're the one who walks through." Claire whispered that the cabin gave him a choice. Reed nodded. "It always does. But once you choose, it remembers." Nick asked if they were really free now. Reed's smile faded. "Maybe. Or maybe you're just in the waiting place. That space between getting off and deciding what to do next." He looked up, eyes serious now. "Thing is, if you don't choose something soon, the train might circle back. And next time, it doesn't give a second ride." Claire looked at Nick. They both realized they had escaped the house, the tracks, the doors. But they hadn't yet decided where they belonged. And somewhere in the frozen distance, they heard it again. A whistle. Not loud, not near, but waiting. Between two fires, Nick sat by the fire, holding the warm tin cup in both hands. The tea was bitter but comforting. Across from him, Reed watched the flames like they were telling him something only he could hear. Claire sat beside Nick, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on the trees beyond the clearing. The whistle they had heard earlier was gone now. Silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that feels like a question hanging in the air. Reed finally spoke again. He said the hardest part wasn't leaving the train. It was deciding where to go afterward. Nick asked him how long he had been out here. Reed didn't answer with numbers. He said time didn't feel the same once he stepped off. Days didn't follow each other like they used to. Sometimes, he'd wake up and the trees looked younger. Other times, the stars changed places. Claire asked if there were others like them. Reed said yes. Some chose to forget. Some tried to return to their lives. A few disappeared into the woods, chasing shadows. He stayed here because he wanted to remember, because remembering was the only way he knew it had all happened. Nick didn't know what he wanted. He thought leaving the train would be the end of it, but now it felt like just another station. He looked at Claire and asked what she wanted. She said she wanted to find her family. She hadn't thought about them much while on the train or inside the cabin, but now their faces returned to her mind like a current breaking through ice. Her younger brother, her father's garden, the kitchen table where she used to study. She didn't know if they were still in the same town or if they had moved on without her. But she had to try. Reed nodded. He told them the way back wasn't easy. There was no road, no map, but sometimes the forest let you through if it knew your reason. Nick asked what his reason would be. Reed didn't answer. He just stared at him. Nick thought about Alex, about the letter he never mailed, about the day he got the news and the day after that when he didn't speak to anyone for hours. He thought about the train showing him that moment again and how powerless he had felt. Then he stood. He said he wanted to remember, but not to stay stuck in it. He wanted to find a way forward that didn't erase the past, but didn't let it chain him either. Claire stood too. Reed smiled softly. He pointed west. He said there was an old ranger trail 2 days from here. If they were honest with themselves, the forest might show them the path. As they gathered their things, Reed handed Nick a small metal coin. It was rusted and old, but had a train engraved on one side. He said if they ever heard the whistle again and didn't know what to do, the coin might help them remember what they chose. They stepped into the woods without looking back. The snow was falling again, quiet and steady. This time, the silence felt different. Not empty, just waiting. The path that listens. The forest was quiet as Nick and Claire walked away from Reed's camp. The sky above was overcast but not threatening. Snow fell gently, each flake catching light that didn't seem to come from the sun. The trail ahead wasn't marked by footprints or signs. It was just a soft indentation through the trees, as if something had passed this way long ago and the forest remembered. Claire walked slightly ahead, scanning the trees. Nick followed, his hand occasionally touching the small coin Reed had given him. He didn't understand how a coin could help him make a choice, but it gave him comfort. Not like a weapon or a tool, more like a reminder that he was still real. They walked for hours. At first, the path was narrow but clear. Pines on both sides leaned gently, their branches hanging heavy with snow. Then it opened slightly, revealing broken stones in the earth, remnants of something old. Maybe an abandoned cabin foundation. Maybe the edge of a road that had once led somewhere people had lived. Claire stopped. She said she felt like they were being watched. Nick agreed, but not by something hostile. It felt more like the forest itself was watching them, noticing their presence, judging their direction. He asked if she wanted to stop. She shook her head. They kept walking. Just after midday, the trees thinned, and they came upon something unexpected. An old railway signal post. Its paint was faded, its frame leaning sideways. Below it, buried in the snow, were the remains of a rusted track. Not a full set, just two broken rails disappearing into the ground. Claire crouched beside them and brushed off the snow. She found a plaque, cracked and nearly unreadable. But Nick recognized the emblem. It belonged to the same line as Train 47. Claire stood and looked around. There was no train here, no cabin, no door, but the forest had brought them to this place on purpose. Nick thought maybe it was a marker, a boundary, a checkpoint between what was and what might be. Claire pulled out the map she had drawn from Reed's directions. There was nothing on it about a signal post, but the compass she had borrowed pointed west again, past the post, toward thicker woods. She said they should keep going. Nick paused. He looked back once, then followed. As they moved deeper into the trees, the light began to change. Not darker, just different, softer, more golden, like sunlight filtering through old glass. Nick looked up and noticed something strange. Birds, 3 of them, sitting quietly on a branch, watching. They hadn't seen a single animal since the train, since the cabin. Not a rabbit, not a squirrel, nothing. But now the birds watched without fear. Claire noticed too. She whispered that maybe they were close. The trees ahead began to shift. They no longer bent inward. They opened. The trail widened. And in the distance, they saw something that made them both stop. A fence, not a wooden one. A modern chain-link fence with a warning sign tilted in the snow. It marked the edge of a ranger station. Real civilization. Real power lines. A small tower blinked red in the fog beyond. Nick breathed slowly. Claire laughed, softly, like she wasn't sure if she should believe it. Then a gust of wind came through the trees, and with it, barely heard, the faintest sound of a train whistle. Far, far behind them. They didn't look back. They stepped toward the fence, toward the world they once knew. The gate that opens. The chain-link fence stretched across the tree line like a forgotten border. Snow had piled against its base, half burying the warning sign. Authorized personnel only. Ranger Service Outpost 6. The letters were faded, but still readable. Claire brushed snow from the metal and stared at the building beyond. A small ranger station stood near the edge of a frozen lake. It looked real, worn down but functioning. A radio antenna blinked red from the roof. Smoke rose gently from a chimney. A snowmobile was parked beside a wooden porch, half covered in ice. Nick rattled the fence. It was unlocked. They stepped through the gate. Their boots crunched on gravel instead of snow. The ground here had been cleared. Someone had been here recently. They moved toward the station with careful steps. Claire knocked on the door. No answer. Nick knocked harder. Then the door opened slightly. A man stood inside, middle-aged, heavy coat, thick beard. His eyes narrowed when he saw them. He asked who they were. Claire said her name quietly. The man stepped back. He said he hadn't heard that name in over a year. Nick froze. Over a year? He asked what date it was. The man stared, then told him. It was February, but not the February they had left behind. It was the next year. 13 months had passed. Claire stepped back like the ground had shifted beneath her. The man let them in. He gave them hot water and a place to sit. His name was Daniels. He was a backup ranger sent to cover this post after the previous team had vanished. He said people have been searching for a missing train for months, a train that never reached Anchorage. Several passengers were unaccounted for. No wreck was found, no signal, just one frozen photograph that had appeared in the ranger's mail pouch one morning. He pulled it from his drawer and handed it to them. It showed Claire, standing beside Nick, on the train platform. Neither of them remembered the photo being taken. Daniel said it had no return address. No explanation. Nick and Claire looked at each other. The train hadn't forgotten them, and someone else hadn't either. Daniel said they weren't the first to come out of the woods. A woman had arrived months earlier. Thin, pale, wouldn't speak. She vanished before help could reach her. Claire asked where she had gone. Daniels shook his head, said she walked back into the forest. Without a coat. Nick gripped the coin in his pocket. The one Reed gave him. Still warm. Claire stood and walked to the window. Snow still fell, but it felt different now. Less like a threat, more like a reminder. Daniels asked what had happened to them. Nick didn't know how to answer. Instead, he said the train didn't take people. It waited for them to get on. Daniels didn't ask again. That night, Nick and Claire slept on real beds, under real roofs. But just before he drifted off, Nick thought he heard something. A hum, a rhythm, almost like rails moving under snow. Far, far away. The last whistle. The sun rose slowly over the white horizon. For the first time in what felt like years, Nick woke up to light instead of shadows. The ranger station was still, the stove warm, the air filled with the smell of real coffee. Claire sat at the table, sipping from a steaming mug. She was wrapped in a thick coat, staring out the window toward the forest. Nick joined her. Neither of them spoke for a while. They just listened. To silence. To wind. To life. Daniels came in later and handed them both a file. Inside were printed copies of news reports, investigation summaries, and passenger lists from the missing Train 47. Their names were on every page, red stamped as presumed dead. Nick flipped through it slowly. He read his own name like it belonged to someone else. Claire stared at a list of faces. Faces of people they had passed in the cabin, on the platform, in the mirrors. Most were still missing. Some had been found in the woods, unable to speak. A few were buried without names. Nick placed the folder aside. Claire looked at Daniels. She asked what would happen to them now. Daniels shrugged, said they could stay until the next helicopter came through. Maybe try to return to their lives. But he warned them. Most people didn't understand what had happened. The world had moved on without them. Nick and Claire stood outside later that afternoon, watching the wind move across the snow. The trees no longer loomed like monsters. They swayed gently, as if nodding farewell. Claire said she was going home. Not just her town. To herself. Nick nodded. He said he would go too. Not to the past, but somewhere new. Somewhere quiet. He reached into his pocket and held the coin Reed had given him. It had cooled, but it hadn't disappeared. He buried it in the snow at the edge of the clearing, near the fence, like planting a memory where no one could take it. That night, before sleep took them, they sat by the fire. Claire asked if he still thought about the train. Nick said yes, but he didn't fear it anymore. She asked if he thought it was real. He said it didn't matter. They had made a choice. They had stepped off, and that was all that counted. As they drifted into sleep, the forest sighed around them. And in the deepest part of the night, far beyond mountains and trees, a train passed quietly through the snow. No passengers, no whistle, just silence. And then it was gone.